We'll now turn to member questions, and the chair now recognizes himself for 5 minutes for questioning. We'll start with Mr. Gould. Will you please explain why it is legally problematic for the Fed to keep secret the stress test models and methodologies?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Because the models and scenarios that the Fed is using, and at least with respect to the models not disclosing, are not put out for public comment, and because the Fed relies upon those models and scenarios to essentially calculate the stress capital buffer, which is a binding constraint on banks' capital, those models and scenarios are essentially legislative rules, and under the Administrative Procedure Act, they have to go through public notice and comment rulemaking.
And are there also legal problems with the fact that the Fed does not give the public any opportunity to comment on the scenarios used in the tests?
Well, yes, public comment is a requirement under the APA for legislative rules. So yes, that is a problem as well.
And could public comment improve not only the process, but the tests themselves?
Yeah, so setting aside the legal requirement that they have to do this from a policy standpoint, yes, it could inform it. In fact, that's the entire rationale behind public comment generally. It is to inform the agency promulgating the rule on how to make the rule better.
Mr. Kovas, a number of commenters, including you, have noted the overlap between the stress testing and the Basel III Endgame proposal, as I suggested in my opening comments. Can you talk about how supervisory stress tests already account for market risk and operational risk?
Thank you for the question. Yes, so the Fed projects operational risk losses over the 9 quarters of the stress horizon. That reduces revenues under stress for the banks subject to the stress test. So operational risk is already accounted. For market risk, the Fed, as for the largest banks, subjects the largest banks to the global market shock, for which assumes an instantaneous shock to banks' market positions and results in significant losses. So operational risk losses account for about 25% of losses of all the banks subject to the stress tests. Market risk losses account for roughly 20% for market risk losses for the largest banks in the stress test.
And we are told that the Fed is undertaking broad and material changes to the proposal, but if the Basel III Endgame proposal were finalized as it has been proposed, do you think that there would be a double count of these risks, meaning that banks will be required to hold more capital than is necessary to address their market and operational risks?
Yeah, so basically the Basel III proposal basically doubles capital requirements for operational risk and materially increases capital requirements for market risk. The way the banks allocate capital across business lines, they look at the entire capital requirement, both based on the Basel framework as well as the result of the stress tests. There are significant overlaps because both of the stress losses, operational risk losses, for example, they are stress losses in the stress test by definition. Also under the new Basel framework, that also are considered to be stress losses. They are all calibrated back to the global financial crisis, large mortgage losses that the banks experienced, and they effectively are a double count in the sense that they are requiring banks to hold capital for exactly the same types of risks.
So I think that's very important that the Fed then take into account as they undertake these broad and material changes to Basel III, that they take into account what the stress tests actually require as well. So that there's not double counting. Mr. Campbell, finally, there were numerous concerns expressed on the Basel III Endgame proposal. Fed Chair Powell and Vice Chair Barr have both stated that these comments have been helpful in ensuring proper consideration of the costs and benefits and the expected decrease in availability of credit. It seems to me that the static capital requirements have benefited greatly from transparency and public engagement. At the end of the day, stress tests are essentially dynamic capital requirements, as Mr. Gould pointed out. Is there any reason to think that stress tests wouldn't similarly benefit from transparency and public engagement?
No, I think in fact, indeed, there's every reason to believe that the stress tests would benefit greatly from that kind of public engagement, as evidenced by the Basel III Endgame process. There's been a voluminous amount of comment on those rules in that proposal. Most of the commenters, quite frankly, have been from non-banks, as you indicated. The Federal Reserve, key senior policymakers have indicated that those comments have been broad and helpful and that they will result in broad and material changes. So it's puzzling, quite frankly, to understand why the Federal Reserve wouldn't want to avail itself of the same benefit in the context of...
And finally, Mr. Campbell, can you address this accusation of gaming with transparency?
Sure. So I think gaming is a misnomer. And I think, the issue is that banks use information in the regulatory structure and the regulatory architecture to engage in prudent risk management. They look at risk weights, they look at GSIB capital surcharges. All of the facets of the bank regulatory framework are available to them. They can look at those things. They're publicly available because they're in the notice and comment process, and they use that information to engage in prudent risk management. That's no different for stress testing than it would be in the way that firms look at risk weights in the context of Basel III Endgame. They all feed into the total overall capital requirement that applies to the firm, and they use that information.
Thank you. My time has expired. The chair now recognizes the ranking member, Dr. Foster.